Hello there everyone, Esso here. So, I've kept it no secret in the last year or so that I've begun taking strong influence in my thinking and general approach to libertarianism from Austro-libertarian figures associated with the Alliance of the Libertarian Left, particularly Karl Hess, Roderick Long, Gary Chartier, and Sheldon Richman, though Konkin has always been an influence on me as long as I've been an anarchist, though I guess I never understood this side of his philosophy until more recently. Anyway, though I've spoken in detail about these ideas over the Backalley Discord and have changed many minds through my server along with others, I've done little to nothing in the way of explaining these concepts I'm a proponent of through video form. For this, I apologize. I admittedly haven't been uploading as much as I'd like to have for 2020 in general. There are a couple of major factors causing this, but I digress because that's not really relevant right now. Not having posted an in-depth explanation of what I'm actually a proponent of, but referencing concepts in the ALL circles through my YouTube videos has led to many disagreements and quite a few misunderstandings, along with active attempts to misrepresent my views to unsuspecting people who aren't in the Discord-tarian loop. Not helping matters is that the explanations which are the most readily available of the disagreements between ALL libertarians and the typical Walter Blockite Ancaps are usually either very difficult to get into because the writing and or presentation is written with the assumption that the audience is already deeply familiar with the libertarian philosophy and various competing methodologies within various different areas of study, and are therefore much more difficult for general audiences to understand or familiarize themselves with compared to the work of someone like Jeff Deist or, well, Walter Block. Today I'm going to be explaining what the ALL is as simply as I possibly can in a way which would still meaningfully represent how left market anarchists or agorists would differ in their approach to liberty from the typical one promoted by the Mises Institute or the political self-proclaimed libertarians. So I should address the elephant in the room, and that is the association with the left, along with the terribly misleading name Alliance of the Libertarian Left, which almost implies an attempt to create a political coalition with self-identifying political leftists. In the case of the latter claim, it's just bad branding, in my opinion at least, especially for a libertarian group, but there's nothing which, ethically speaking, I would argue, even in terms of framing, that would be found objectionable by Ancaps proposed by the ALL Rothbardians. As for why identification with the left tends to be favored by these groups, well, first we have to understand something known as thickism, and in order to understand thickism, the starting premise for left Rothbardians has to be established. So the way that the modern libertarian movement generally tends to conceive of natural law and ethical philosophy is influenced almost entirely by Murray Rothbard's positions on contract theory, self-ownership, and, well, the non-aggression principle, which are explained in great detail through an essay titled Confiscation and the Homestead Principle. These concepts have never been controversial among philosophical libertarians, and they're not controversial among left Rothbardians. After all, in order to actually construct a criticism of political authority, which can be a claim of truth about the nature of society and doesn't merely rest upon arbitrary factors such as preference or material incentives, one has to, among other things, explain what makes their criticism actually have to be taken into consideration when thinking of the concept of political authority itself. Libertarian philosophy began as, and still is through its entailments, a radical free will critique of religious determinism, and it's a critique of determinism centered around the concept of agency itself being proof that individual moral actors in society have a great deal of autonomy over themselves and factors around them which can influence how scarcity impacts their lives directly, along with their development as people. Only when these principles were applied to the philosophies of action and social organization did people begin finding problems, particularly as is relevant for this video, with the justifications that the state provides for its existence and how it acts towards people in society. See the 1789 essay On Liberty and Necessity written by William Belsham on libertarianism and the 1802 edition of the British Critic to see examples of this evolution in thought taking place, along with the philosophy's origins. In short, the libertarian objection to determinism was of the idea that forces external to moral agents ought to or can influence their agency, just because it can be demonstrated that material or social influences can convince them to change their incentives or influence how they formulate their ideas and think of their interests. Applying this framework to the realm of social order, it's very easy to see how skepticism towards political rule naturally follows. So this is the reason why self-ownership, or sovereignty of the individual as the concept was known before the modern libertarian movement popularized the idea, have always been central concepts to libertarianism, and why it, along with its implications, necessarily have to be. This being said, there hasn't always been, and probably won't ever be from an academic perspective, a uniform ethical philosophy or a specific explanation of what the right way, for lack of a better way of putting it, would be to conceptualize principles of libertarianism. This is a good thing because this means that competing attempts to explain what the best way to argue for property would be, just as an example, necessarily have to justify how they're conceived. One can't just say something is property and not explain why or how or why even property is a valid concept. In other words, this makes the concept of natural rights claims necessary to libertarianism as well, and this is precisely the point where the ALL diverges from the mainstream Rothbardians. So Rothbard, in his most influential works over the libertarian movement, wrote about these concepts from the Kantian framework, at least after he started associating with Cato. For those who aren't familiar, the Kantian methodology in ethical philosophy is an approach which would argue that actions inherently have moral assignments ascribed to them. That moral correctness, so to speak, is a basis to argue that an action can be a law in society, and therefore, from claims about morality themselves, people deduce how they should act towards others. In other words, claims about whether or not an action is ethically true are the same as claims about how people apply morality to their own conscious thinking about a subject. So law is arrived at by everyone in said framework accepting what is morally true. So if we were to say, for example, that killing babies is wrong, well, like every ethical philosophy, Kantians assert that this is demonstrably true, but the Kantians argue that because this is true, this somehow means there's something necessary, the categorical imperative, about this truth existing which compels people to apply this to their own moral frameworks. Left Rothbardians, however, differ in their thinking, because we argue from the premise of Aristotelian ethics, forming our approach to natural law libertarianism, which would reject the notion that ethical truth and whether one's rights are respected are dependent on how people in a given society understand morality and apply moral thinking to their actions. Instead, the left Rothbardian would argue that ethical outcomes are fundamentally dependent upon the means and actions used to achieve them. So another way of thinking about this would be that the Kantians start by assuming the NAP to be true, then from there look at what this implies, then decide from there what would be prescriptively considered a libertarian moral code and legal order. Aristotelian libertarians start at philosophical libertarianism, take all of the implications of philosophical libertarianism, and use these principles to explain what the NAP necessarily is, and then use this to inform what actions must be taken in order to attempt to make it so society can be organized around justice, where these ethical conclusions can be arrived at. And this is truly the only real fundamental disagreement between these two camps of thought. But as anyone in the libertarian movement can see, this single difference significantly changes how one conceptualizes libertarian principles. For one, left Rothbardians consider any political action to be at odds with achieving anti-state libertarian ends, whereas thin libertarians, or mainstream Rothbardians as they're more conventionally called, would be indifferent to the means used to achieve libertarian ends because they don't recognize the concept of contradictory means and ends. Which leads me back to thickism, or thick libertarianism, another exclusively Aristotelian take, And this is by far the most controversial aspect of the alliance of the libertarian left's approach among the broader libertarian movement because of how it's been misconstrued by the thin boys. So thickism or thick libertarianism is a broad concept which specifically exists within the Aristotelian approach to libertarian natural law. Explaining this is rather difficult, and in part is the reason why I explained earlier step by step how early libertarians came to the conclusion that political rule was illegitimate, despite some, if not most of the people watching this video probably already knowing this. For those of you who understood that prior to the introduction of this video, then congratulations, something something thick joke. Generally, thickism is the concept of libertarian philosophy necessarily itself creating a reason to be skeptical of certain cultural practices, social values, models of organization, or conceptual positions in philosophy due to requiring this in order to make libertarianism an actual truth claim about the nature of social organization and as a basis to construct a framework where one could definitively point to what a libertarian strategy against the state is. Entailment or application thickness are the positions which assert that principles within what are seen by thin types as other areas of philosophy are inherently related to the libertarian criticism of the state. These claims would need to be true to reach skepticism towards political rule and the NAP as a conclusion, thus said positions are entailed by one who argues libertarianism and have a necessary reason to be a proponent of to be internally consistent, such as skepticism directed towards the presence of certain types of firm, property claims, or contracts which between both parties are not coercive, or by law are considered just property claims, but basing this skepticism on the grounds that aggression, coercion, or state manipulation which benefits a politically partnered class of producers or groups of people by externalizing costs onto others and raising the barrier to entry for market participation by making it more cost-intensive to be self-reliant or promote competition are the reason that these associations exist, or that the state defending certain property claims which could not otherwise be defended under the homesteading principle are the reason why certain property titles are maintained and are defined in the first place in state societies. In short, the way that thin Rothbardians would conceive of the NAP and libertarianism are that the only things libertarians ought to concern themselves with are what is compatible with the NAP and what isn't, because from their perspective, there's no inherent reason to be concerned about anything other than this thinly conceived of social commitment, hence the term thin libertarianism. The thick boys point to what the NAP is as an ethical claim, that because it's an ethical claim, the presence of a state doesn't magically stop it from being true, and from here would propose that there is a necessary reason to be concerned about various subjects which aren't necessarily seen as being incompatible with the NAP, but are propped up as the dominant models through the creation of artificial scarcity by state coercion, and arguing that these conditions interfere with its consistent application in society. This is the reason, for instance, that I and many other left Rothbardians particularly express skepticism towards firms which operate around organizational hierarchies, the centralization in general of finance, and platforms of communication. These organizational models, in and of themselves, are not in concept coercive in nature. However, as we've seen with the state's use of financial manipulation, corporate law, copyright law, and subsidy to obtain leverage over firms like Patreon or Facebook to influence their policies about speech and who is or isn't allowed on their platforms, it's clear that these models in and of themselves have weaknesses that make them particularly susceptible to being influenced by state action and are seen by the state as being very valuable to the state's interests, and therefore libertarians ought to be concerned with these models because ethical ends cannot be pursued through centralized platforms within the state's political economy for these reasons. The state has both direct financial and social reasons for promoting these types of organizations. They promote dependence along with disincentivizing local networking, and they make it easier to keep track of the resources people spend and work to obtain. Conjunction thickness is the principle of arguing for or denouncing cultural practices and social organizations on the grounds that they, in practice, either will necessarily lead to or outright involve the systematic use of coercive violence against innocent people because they emphasize leveraging one person, type of person, or group above another. For instance, opposition and skepticism towards authoritarian parenting techniques, or supporting unions that aren't involved with state agencies and rejecting political means, such as through the IWW. Then there's grounds thickness. Grounds thickness is the notion that proponents of the NAP necessarily have a reason to ask questions about what counts as a moral agent or a right violation. For instance, if you were to say that it's bad to attack Slavics, I don't know what you mean by attacking or what a Slavic is. So this statement wouldn't tell me anything about its nature in relation to the application of the NAP as a conclusion, and therefore one doesn't really know how to go about achieving that goal or how to process this argument. Therefore, there's necessarily a reason to place emphasis on conceptual claims, what counts as an axiom or a line of reasoning, so that what principles are being defended or proposed could be readily understood by anyone. Ideas such as property theory and exclusive ownership rights sound from a superficial perspective to explain a certain axiom or principle, but in reality, their conceptual basis isn't necessarily demonstrated by simply describing something as a property or a right. So what's meant by these axioms and the basis upon which these things are claimed should be called into question, because there are many different competing ideas within these various areas of interest. Some explain more and are more valid than others. If the conclusions which we argue need to have a tangible basis upon which they could be demonstrated, then it would be incoherent to argue that the axioms which these conclusions are dependent upon in order to even exist don't need to be proven and shown to be valid. This is why, for example, left Rothbardians are skeptical of corporations in the legal market economy, along with the legal standard for private property, but we'll get back to the latter in a moment. We know that state aggression is the cause for certain incentives, or models of organization to be seen as profitable, and the state uses coercive force to suppress other models of organization and firms, along with actors who attempt to produce or otherwise put resources into society. For example, the reason why sweatshop labor in China is seen as the most highly valued preference of the workers and the producers. So we'd agree that there is an act of aggression being committed here, or at the very least that libertarians would have grounds upon which to be skeptical of sweatshop labor, correct? Well, according to thin libertarianism, there is no act of aggression being committed because the owner of the firm, legally speaking, and the consumer aren't directly themselves engaging in an act of aggression, even though their condition, and why they're associating the way that they are, is the product of state aggression, or at the very least a byproduct of it. This same case could be made for the entire framework of the political economy. Corporate law, licensing laws, the copyright infrastructure, treaties created by international cartels and enforced by states, monopolized commerce, and outlets of communication all work fundamentally to distort incentives and put people who aren't affiliated with the state in direct positions of submission to people who've gone through these legal hoops to obtain more political clout within the state, and the state a tremendous amount of leverage above those said legal market actors. Therefore, there's reason to be skeptical at the very least of any private business in the legal market, or the extent to which legally private ownership and property claims could be compatible with actual Rothbardian homesteading and contract theory, since the standard for ownership claims and a legislative framework are unilaterally defined by the state. So in summary, the ALL argues virtually the exact same things from the standpoint of ethical philosophy which mainstream Austro-libertarians would, except approaching from an Aristotelian ethical framework. Because of this, the ALL sees natural law's consistent application as a goal achieved through the bottom-up subversion of the political and social order constructed by the state with libertarian counteraction, by which I mean individuals or groups investing their own resources to establish an infrastructure that would undermine the state's influence over various different aspects of society, and also, from this take on ethics, a necessary reason to be concerned with things which are not necessarily directly endorsed or opposed by the NAP itself. Now, let me go over a few common counter-arguments along with the reasons why this position won me over, for lack of a better way of putting it, though I'm sure many watching need nothing more than an explanation to realize that this is a way of explaining libertarian philosophy that's more consistent and explains way more. Since, after all, in order to even argue libertarianism, this entails a particular view about society, action, property ethics, ethical philosophies, etc., in order to even have a coherent claim of truth against the nature of political authority. Most, if not all, of the criticisms regarding the alliance of the libertarian left can all be responded to more or less the same way, which is that the proponents of these arguments don't understand where the actual cause of disagreement lies. This applies to the aforementioned prominent thin libertarian figures, for instance, like Walter Block or Jeffrey Tucker, along with the so-called paleo-libertarians, who have argued some variation of either the NAP can't be used in and of itself to make arguments against positions in subjects unrelated to ethical outcomes, or you are skeptical of certain practices which aren't coercive in and of themselves, therefore you're anti-property, anti-Rothbardian, statist, etc., etc. In short, we're not arguing that it can. In fact, precisely our argument against the thin libertarians is that their logical and ethical views, taken to their conclusion, would at the very least have no ability to justify reaching libertarian conclusions, and at worst, in the case of the Hoppian crowd specifically, entails endorsing actively anti-property views. Those who would argue this, I think, are confused about the concept of entailments, and see that as Aristotelian suggesting that unrelated topics need to be roped into whatever philosophy is being argued for, when in reality, what we're trying to do is explain that philosophies, principles, axioms, or models of logic are all conclusions, and as conclusions cannot exist without having entailments to explain why they're true, or what is even meant by them. The fact that thin types not only see this as adding things to libertarianism which have nothing to do with libertarianism, but can't even seem to understand just how one's approach to logic or their understanding of how axioms inform their conclusions can change just what it is that's even being argued, goes to show how truly weak the thinly conceived NAP really is. The latter is ridiculous because the NAP, from the Aristotelian perspective, is the conclusion of, among other philosophical positions, the affirmation of property, self-ownership, and free will being legitimate concepts. So if you're wondering why I didn't address these in detail, well, you can see my detailed rebuttal towards the start of the video where I explain exactly what the ALL actually argues. Now, on to the aspects I would highlight and point to which led me to reconsider my approach to thinking of libertarianism. So, for those of you who haven't read Lysander Spooner's essay on nullification, or John Hasnass's The Myth of the Rule of Law, which, by the way, I couldn't recommend anymore whether or not you're a libertarian, because they just absolutely shred the concepts of legal positivism and social contract theories. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Anyway, from the perspective of libertarian philosophy and ethical philosophy in general, these works demonstrate two very crucial points. That during a dispute, both parties have to be able to contest not only claims, but the ethical framework in which these claims are being made from within. Say, for example, if someone were to attempt and create an arbitration claim with another on the grounds that the other person supposedly committed a trespass against their person and or property, fine. But what if the premise of this claim was something which had no basis in any sort of ethical framework, and there was no way around any tangible basis to argue that the first person committed any sort of trespass? I.e., the one looked at the other in a way that the other didn't emotionally feel comfortable with. Arbitration cannot possibly be settled under circumstances where one person has complete leverage over the countering position, and this is what could effectively be afforded to a side of a dispute that has constructed a claim where they can solely, with no discretion other than their own, alter what counts as a trespass, and therefore what damages are owed to them by the party they claim victimized them. That is, unless what is being argued is whether or not the premise of the first party's claim is valid, rather than evaluating whether or not the actual claim itself is true, since what's essentially being argued in said dispute is whether or not one has a claim right to be compensated for another person causing some abstract sense of discomfort. Now, in such a scenario, it's made immediately apparent why one has to be able in any conflict to justify the basis of their claim that they have a right which was violated, on top of just providing proof of the other person's alleged actions that took place, then just providing some random payment and claiming that the other person owes this to them. If this isn't the case, then what counts as a right as well as a crime are entirely arbitrary, and this isn't something which most thin libertarians would deny. As a matter of fact, the major libertarian criticism of political authority is that this is both an inevitable and necessary consequence of having a so-called rule of law. Kantian ethical philosophy, however, is not capable of creating such distinctions through which to demonstrate why any given ethical concept is valid, or how one competing conception of said ethical concept can be more true than another because of its vulgar moral naturalist assumptions. In other words, since it assumes that ethical claims are not observations about actions and relations which can or can't be just in interactions between people in social settings, rather a basis for how one ascribes morality to themselves, or how morality is imposed onto a society, that individuals pursuing justice then is just derived from making everyone apply a uniform standard of morality in said communities, rather than being an emergent property of social organization itself, with the factors that those concerned about justice would take into consideration being a question of how to undermine the viability of organizations and practices which incentivize coercion or make it more difficult to protect oneself from them. Simplifying further, if an ethical framework is treated as though its ethical claims don't require justification, then any argument or ethical claim you could conceive couldn't be challenged, as all you would need to do is just claim you demonstrated them by citing their existence, effectively boiling all claims about ethics and social organization down to the same sort of relativism which they claim to be providing clarity in the face of. Some questions which I'm sure quite a few may be asking then is, how exactly can a libertarian be a Kantian? Or more pressingly, hey, I see people like Shane or Walter Block arguing from the Kantian perspective against things like globalization or central banking, which Kantian ethics, if thought of in a consistent framework, wouldn't be able to justify. So it seems like you can arrive at these conclusions using moral naturalism. Well, quite simply, both of these questions are valid, but I believe more so that because of these exact questions, that despite citing the work of Kant and arguing from a self-purported morally naturalist Kantian position, I don't believe that anyone who considers themselves to be a philosophical libertarian actually does hold these views, if they claim to hold those views. In other words, I think that libertarians who fancy themselves as Kantians are confused. As noted earlier, if one were to approach conceiving of ethics in the way described, then there wouldn't be any way for them to be able to make a coherent case against political authority, because there would be no tangible grounds on which to argue that an ethical claim is true, or what the implications of it being true would entail. If as a libertarian you have no base to argue against political authority, then you have no way of arguing that it's definitively wrong for political authority to exist, or no way of refuting political authority. Hence, what you're arguing isn't libertarianism. Let's take an example Murray Rothbard himself provided in For a New Liberty. Suppose that libertarians were successful in subverting the state's ability to function, and we've put so much pressure on the state model of organization that the US government and its various branches are ready to dissolve. But right before the government falls apart, it legally declares that counties or even states are the private property of the Kennedy family, the Rockefeller family, or so on, for each arbitrarily divided jurisdiction. The government then declares that it will no longer tax people, use coercive means to engineer artificial scarcity, or use its monopoly influence to manipulate supply chains. Does a libertarian recognize this legal redefinition of the infrastructure in modern state society to be a libertarian conclusion? Obviously not. And I'm not suggesting that most libertarians who don't think of themselves as Aristotelians would. In function, it's the exact same monopoly system which defined the political authority which libertarians are so skeptical of, and therefore the very entailments which lead libertarians to be skeptical of the state lead libertarians to reject attempts for political authority to rebrand itself. What I am suggesting is the same proposition Murray Rothbard initially was, which in context is that there's no way to criticize political authority without a coherent natural rights theory, that at most, all you could say from any sort of relativistic standpoint is that from your perspective, you have preferences which you think political rule is at odds with, but have no real claim against it. However, because moral naturalist interpretations of natural rights theories are presuppositional, thus don't innately need to prove why their principles are valid, functionally, there's no difference between the moral naturalists and the so-called ethical relativist positions. And because of this, the categorical imperative as a basis for the libertarian claim against the state carries the same issue as a relativist claim against the state for libertarianism. So I don't think that there are any genuine Kantian libertarians, because criticism of political rule as a claim about the nature of social organization, which it has to be in order to explain that anything is wrong with the state's role in society, necessitates it to be seen as a thickly conceived of series of philosophical entailments. Because if it is, we can explain our axioms without resorting to presupposition or circular reasoning, instead deriving them from conceptual truth, in turn allowing us to base our claims on something which could be demonstrated by checking whether or not an axiom has a consistent and decisive reasoning supporting it. If you were to go back to the examples I provided earlier of sweatshops in the third world, you obviously don't see anyone who considers themselves to be libertarians providing defenses of such organizations, despite also promoting the Kantian perspective of ethics. They recognize correctly that these organization models are only able to function in the modern world because the political economy of the nations they're based in have used coercion to engineer a white market where these circumstances are the only way for people through legal means to obtain an income, because of market manipulation in the financial realm via central banking cartels, and down to the very way in which raw materials are distributed through the influence of cartels like the World Trade Organization or the Trilateral Commission, even though they would have no way of arguing this if they had started with their claimed ethical views. So in short, you can't argue libertarianism without a decisive claim about natural rights, and you can't argue natural rights unless you have a way within the type of logic you use to prove axioms valid. The only type of logic which can verify axiomatic consistency is the Aristotelian model. Therefore, libertarianism is inherently Aristotelian. Thus, the left Rothbardian approach is valid. This leads nicely into what I know will be the most controversial section, which is the association with the left. Well, more accurately, the label. Because despite what the name Alliance of the Libertarian Left suggests, as noted earlier, this is not a sacrifice of libertarian principles in pursuit of what are perceived to be politically leftist values, or an attempt to establish any sort of coalition-like movement with groups which self-identify as political leftists. Instead, there are two ways, at least historically, to conceive of the left-right dichotomy. Firstly, following the French Revolution up to Karl Marx gaining significant influence in the First International Workingmen's Association, was that the so-called right were proponents of the regime, and or reactionaries who defended the feudal political order, while the left broadly was made up of movements and political affiliations who rejected the regime and concept of a regime on the grounds that regimes themselves promoted all sorts of ways in which people are made unable to associate voluntarily by making them more dependent upon the state and political organizations which the state promotes to have its interests met by creating artificial scarcity, protecting monopoly cartels, using violence to socially engineer behavior, along with manipulating market signals to force people into disadvantaged positions to merely make a living, creating a political class in the process whose interests are necessarily hostile to the people who are not state actors. Generally, the old left, so to speak, is made up of groups like Owenites, mutualists, laissez-faire liberals like Thomas Hodgkins or Frederick Bastiat, and individualist or market anarchists as we would call them today. Not only this, but prior to the later part of the 19th century, all of these groups recognized that they shared common goals, because it was completely uncontroversial until then that everything which I'd identified previously were specifically the aims and eventual end product of the state's influence over society. The state itself, along with its defenders, even regularly cited the monopolies and artificial property titles defended by the state as grounds upon which to defend the state as an institution which was necessary for social cohesion, in much the same way that statists do currently with state intervention. Specifically, though, it was argued that these monopolies and property titles were just because a social contract, and the state is just the will of the people, and that it's good for there to be less competition along with greater dependence upon political market firms and state institutions because these were set up or recognized by the state, and since the state represents your interests, obviously they're more trustworthy. The only functional change in how the dichotomy between free association and the state's molestation of these associations is thought of from now and the 19th century is that the state's coercive influence causing cartelization and limiting people's options were instead not virtuous acts of the political class, but instead that a political class was introduced into society through the reform of the feudal political economy that's corrupting the state in favor of their own interests, and that the state's intervention was then framed as a leveling force against these political interests as opposed to being the root of said interests. On top of this, as was detailed extensively by old leftist libertarians living in the period where this transition was taking place, such as Benjamin Tucker throughout the publication of Liberty, Albert J. Nock in Our Enemy the State, and or Herbert Spencer in On the New Toryism, both the old left and the old right characterized their ideal conclusions specifically by the way that those conclusions were pursued, as opposed to just what they were. In other words, the notion that the ends are a reflection of the means used to achieve them was totally uncontroversial by the standards of both the leftist and rightist views of the regime. But by the end of the 19th century, state academia, politicians, and political interests began promoting something we now refer to as political science, which you've probably heard of but never really thought about, and never realized, therefore, that it's actually a rather deceptive attempt to fuse social study and politics, founded upon nothing more than the structuralist presupposition that societies are defined by their states. Since societies have to exist in order for states to exist, it's pretty easy to see why the state didn't even attempt to defend this idea and just sort of began institutionalizing it and promoting it en masse in various forms of media by platforming the work of personalities like Max Weber, Karl Marx, Charles Dickens, and Mark Twain. Anyway, because of this, most figures within the left began promoting the idea that their ends could be achieved through imperialism and state cartelization of the market, as opposed to subverting the state's political economy and promoting forms of decentralized counter-infrastructure. And thus, most of the left slowly turned into another type of what we would now call the old right. And what we now identify as an anti-political position is essentially what remains of what was once the old left. So a more accurate way to characterize the affiliation with the left, which the left Rothbardians attempt to establish, is that the modern leftists share a long obscured intellectual tradition with libertarians, in spite how far astray they've been led by the influence of Marxism and so-called reformist movements, that their true concerns are actually addressed by libertarian means, and thus their philosophies are actually a corrupt variant of libertarianism. Also, that because political means define exclusively political ends, since political means entail dependence upon the state, do nothing to correct the infrastructure the state has built which allows it to be coercive and to privilege actors with political clout at the expense of others, thus creating further centralization by coercive means. Libertarian ends can only be pursued by market-based, bottom-up means, people investing their own time and resources into creating a subversive counter-infrastructure to the one which the state has constructed. This also means that there's functionally no difference between conclusions if pursued with political means. Therefore, any sort of political spectrum is invalid because aside from being modeled around the assumption that societies can be effectively characterized of how the legislative fiat imposed by a central state apparatus is advertised, because they make this assumption, this means that wherever a so-called political affiliation rests on a political spectrum is dictated by whatever the person creating said model presupposes is meant by left or right, and whatever they presuppose said position would conclude with instead of what it actually does, nor would there be any way to demonstrate this from any sort of political perspective. States, like any other organization, have an interest in maintaining and propagating what requires said organization to sustain itself. The state sustains itself by stealing and creating political privilege through the aforementioned scarcity it's able to manufacture and subsidy it's able to defend. Therefore, there is a true dichotomy in how one views the state along with its role in society. But one's politics have nothing to do with it. Just because one advertises the state's legislation using different terminology and frame their argument differently doesn't mean that what they're arguing functionally is any different than anyone else who defends the state or said legislative decrees. Therefore, the true dichotomy is politics versus anti-politics, hence the 19th century conception of the debate is valid. The alliance of the libertarian left, at least from a rhetorical standpoint, also sets itself apart from the libertarian mainstream for expressing criticism towards capitalism. And like all the other former stances thus far, the position proposed by left Rothbardians is grossly misunderstood by the political left, along with the thin boys. Libertarians in the philosophical sense view society and its relation to any sort of coercive or top-down political planning in the same way that Austrians view political planning in relation to studying markets, which is to say that it's absurd fundamentally to look at the study of these subjects as anything more than the study of properties and conventions which emerge when people associate. Therefore, instead of looking at cultures, justice, action or the structures which emerge in society as something which need to be and inherently are imposed onto society by some sort of community planner, the libertarian sees these as emergent properties that come into being through people associating with one another in social settings. And in general, this view of social organization carries greater explanatory power. After all, if the political science structuralist position were assumed true, this would imply that conventions in society exist outside of societies themselves, which is incoherent. The former view would also imply that the presence of legislative decrees alone could dictate a society's norms and cultures, which I think the existence of counter-economies themselves invalidate this notion. So because libertarian philosophy entails this view of social organization, this also necessarily entails a skepticism towards any sort of universal economic systems, since economic systems are products of political planning, the fact that people have unique dynamic interests, and thus in the absence of state planning would be free to associate in pursuit of their most highly valued preferences, but able to do so without any of the barriers to entry, licensing schemes, and political privilege that defines the modern political economy around a very narrow set of ways people can pursue said most highly valued preferences. Therefore, left Rothbardians neither oppose the Austro-libertarian market or embrace any sort of central planning, but instead take the much more radical stance that a society which has actual free association to the extent that both Austrians and libertarians attempt to argue is just, would entail a total negation of any sort of economic system, and would reject the characterization of free markets as capitalism as a consequence. There are also ethical concerns with the notion of characterizing a free market as being interchangeable with a capitalist political economy. For instance, the way private property claims are established and the grounds upon which they could be defended within a state's legal order are fundamentally dictated by whatever the state claims they can be and however the state chooses to define or enforce them. Following this standard of property would lead to having to defend supply cartels or any of the various central banks around the world on the grounds that they're legally considered private organizations, though as even the daftest person could tell you, these groups are entirely funded by the state, have people hired by the state in order to dictate their organizational policies, and exist for the purpose of manipulating the financial markets along with the production line commodity supply chains of various markets around the world, so that the state has more avenues through which it can control the resources of the people living in their nations. It would also entail having to defend property which was obtained through the state following an eminent domain seizure, the state defending properties which have been abandoned and which legally belong to organizations that no longer exist, and actual slavery, among other ways private property claims are enforced in the modern state societies or in previous decades, which are clearly at odds with the non-aggression principle. There are also issues with the notion that everything in a free society can be exclusively owned by one or more parties, because having a claim of exclusive ownership over a resource entails the right to use force in a defensive sense as a means of protecting said property from others who'd seek to access it and or claim it for themselves. That's fine, but a problem emerges when protecting an exclusive claim requires using force in an active sense against people and or their property in order to simply maintain said claim of ownership. For example, declaring ownership of every road in all directions around a block of houses, and then using force to prevent said people from leaving their homes or freely exercising dominion over said homes, only letting them leave if, say, they all buy a specific lawn ornament from a specific person and place it in their front yards. Attempting to claim exclusive ownership over the roads in this example would necessarily constitute aggression against the homeowners in order to defend said claim. Therefore, said roads couldn't be exclusively owned, which would put them into a state of null ownership. or another way of describing these roads, they would be a commons. Because of the existence of common resources in libertarian principles, it would be inaccurate to characterize capitalism even on its face as either a free market or something compatible with libertarian principles. Which leads me to the final criticism issued by left Rothbardians of capitalism, which is on conceptual grounds. The concept of capitalism doesn't specify a type of property or on what grounds said property claims are derived from, even though property theories, in order to be coherent, need tangible conceptual grounds from which to be derived from, otherwise they're incapable of explaining what they're intended to, that being the implication of rivalrous scarce resources existing within societies of moral agents who act upon them, and claim dominion over them at any given time. The same can be said for the notion of an economic system, since the role of politics in social organization is an extremely controversial topic, and definitely would as a result require some sort of conceptual grounds to point to as a means of deriving what a self-proclaimed ideological capitalist considers to be an economic system in order for capitalism to be treated as an explanation of what one's principles are. Because of this, capitalism can only be consistently treated as a description as opposed to an explanation for what one argues. The problem is that because the concept of capitalism references these concepts in an attempt to characterize whatever it's being ascribed to, it's framed as an explanation of where one's principles are derived from. So capitalism is in a unique place where it's intended to be an explanation of certain principles, but because it only references said principles in a descriptive manner, there's virtually no limit to the amount of things which capitalism could be ascribed to, up to the point where they're contradictory. As a result, there is a reasonable argument to be made that capitalism is what's known as an anti-concept, which, to put simply, is a concept that when introduced into the discourse makes it impossible to have a coherent dialogue about the subject it pertains to, because both parties project their own idea of the principles which the anti-concept in question refers to, and therefore makes it impossible to have a conversation where both parties could be mutually understood. There's some internal disagreement over whether or not capitalism is a valid concept and it's better used as a description of the modern economy defined by state fiat as opposed to a market in an anarchy, and or whether capitalism isn't a coherent concept in and of itself and therefore should be avoided in order to have a more meaningful discourse about the state and economic theory. I lean towards the latter, although there's quite a bit of merit to the former position as I just explained. I could go on, because despite the length of this video, this is, like I stated in the beginning, barely scratching the surface of the nuances in the debates between the Aristotelian and Kantian takes on the NAP, the history of libertarianism, the history of the left, how the left-right dichotomy changed, among the other subjects I covered here. But what was covered today is the bare minimum of what's required to possess a meaningful understanding of what the Alliance of the Libertarian Left actually proposes. So I'll be leaving in the pinned comment links to several lectures and essays written by prominent left Rothbardians that would further elaborate upon the explanation given here, as well as material written by Rothbard himself which substantiates this take specifically on libertarianism. Anyway, that's all for today. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. Also, Heretic and I on his channel, Filthy Heretic, Tuesdays and Fridays have begun a podcast called The Backalley in a ham-fisted attempt to get in on the debate podcast scene. As a way to put out more content, since both Heretic and I have grown accustomed to writing essays which require more time and consideration invested into writing them, as opposed to just chasing trends along with talking about the same shit everyone else with recording equipment and a YouTube channel is. So make sure to tune into that if you want to catch up on our commentaries or interact with us in real time. Alright.